Hello, everybody, and welcome to what is definitely an unplanned episode of the Free Speech Forward podcast. An episode that I wish we would never have had to be doing, but an episode that I personally feel we absolutely need to be doing in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's recent assassination. Because this is a podcast all about free speech, about advocating for free speech, about understanding the value of free speech. And what has just happened here on September 10th is certainly the most horrific attack on free speech that I have seen in my lifetime here on US soil. And I think this really is a pivotal moment, will be a pivotal moment for America and what it means to be America. Those of you who've been following the show know we've recently started a sub-series in celebration of the fact that it is going to be the 250th anniversary of the United States, of this concept of America, where one of our cherished values has been free speech and what will be the direction of this country. We're really at, I believe, a critical inflection point. And so I know Chris and I wanted to hop on and have this conversation and really start to think through what this means and what we can and ought to be doing in this moment. Those of us who do value free speech. Chris, did you want to share any thoughts to get us started here?
Yeah, thank you for that. I echo your points about just how sad and shocking it is that we have to even be doing this, but I can't think of a different or better way to respond than to use our voices in the way that Charlie did to reaffirm and back up his efforts. You know, I've been thinking I agree with you. This is definitely one of the most shocking, probably the most shocking political assassination that we've seen. And I've been trying to think through, is there certainly in our lifetimes, we're roughly similar age, but we are millennials, early millennial children of the
I
80s,
might be late
90s.
Gen X. It's always debatable. I'm on that
We're
cusp
on the
here.
border. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not really on the border, but I'm still early enough on that front end wave that I certainly in spirit feel often Gen X,
Mhm.
sometimes more than millennial. But regardless, point being, we're children of the 80s and 90s era
Yes.
where this just was not mercifully and gratefully American society was relatively more peaceful. There was violence in other ways, and there always has been in
Yes.
American society, but it was political violence in the way that we've been seeing, you know, definitely in recent years, but growing over recent, kind of 10 to 15 years, call it. It seems to have reached a crescendo in this week's assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I've been just mulling why it is so shocking and why I think it's going to be so pivotal. And a couple things stood out to me. Number one was what it represented. Charlie Kirk's, for those of you who weren't huge followers of his he's a conservative activist, a Christian conservative activist. So he leaned heavily on his religious faith to promote his ideas. And he founded the organization Turning Point USA, which was, a political activism organization that more than anything was founded. He wanted to just have a platform to promote his ideas, which is a tried and true American right and endeavor that so many great Americans have engaged in over time of all political persuasions, but then also to model civil discourse and hopefully persuade people to, I mean, ultimately his side, that was the hope, to his more conservative Christian views. But to do it by going into the lion's den, quote unquote, of college universities, in particular, targeting young people, young voices in an environment where conservative and right of center views were not popular and certainly not as common. And to use the friction created by those types of public debates to to draw out, make the case for his values, draw out the errors he saw in kind of left wing values that dominated in campus environments, and hopefully change hearts and minds. I mean, at root, that was his aim. Setting aside whatever you thought of what he specifically advocated for, the content of his ideas or the policy platform he advocated, that was his entire MO. And on Wednesday, when he was killed, that's exactly what he was doing. So to attack someone who was engaging in speech and debate, this is just, it was, I mean, Joy and I recorded a session recently for our Substack about the 9/11 anniversary and how it came, the day before that anniversary. And in the same way that attacked the heart of American power and culture, the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., this really attacks the heart of American values. That it was a literal attack in the middle of someone using their voice to advocate free speech and ideas and to debate civilly with other people, particularly people who disagreed with him. So symbolically and literally, it is an attack on the foundations of our country and society. And then the fact that Charlie is a civilian, a private citizen,
Mm-hmm.
I think adds an extra layer of shock, horror, and fear about this, because it evidences a new dimension to political debates and clashes in our culture. I mean, I don't like to be one of those who says you kind of expect it with politicians and policy leaders, where assassinations tend to take place, because I don't find that acceptable either, and it cannot be acceptable in a free society. But sadly, that is the typical pattern, and you can see where people tend to even rationalize it, or at least say it's not unexpected, because those people are wielding actual power that influences other people's lives. Again, that's not a justification for violence, but to see this taken onto someone who is just a patriotic, ordinary American citizen, albeit a prominent one, that too is shocking. And then the third thing I think that's so troubling, deeply troubling about this attack is what it portends for our future, because it appears this is Friday afternoon of this week, and they just this morning announced that they did in fact catch the killer, also a young man of college age, what seems like, we're going to learn more about it, but what seems to be kind of a typical ordinary American youth. And so the fact that someone like that could be so radicalized to such violence in this way, and to take up arms against somebody whom they disagree with, that has been equally shocking, as has, frankly, the reaction to Charlie's death by a large swath, a sadly, shockingly large swath of our fellow Americans. And I think people are starting to connect those dots and realize that this is an ominous portend.
Or could be.
Or
How do
could
we
be.
make it not?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Could be. So that, I think, were kind of my initial thoughts about the event itself. And, suffice to say, as advocates for free speech, there's no scenario, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, where this is ever acceptable. And we can talk more about the ideology that I think led up to, and even in this moment, in the aftermath, is trying to rationalize his killing. But, more than anything, I just want to stand in solidarity with Charlie as a fellow fighter for freedom, in particular freedom of speech, even though I didn't agree with or subscribe to everything that he believed in and said. My heart and prayers go out to him and his family and friends and all of his loved ones. And I just want to stand and speak out very loudly and clearly that there's no world where snuffing out someone, taking their life, violating their rights because you disagree with them, or because they hold ideas that you disagree with, is ever acceptable. That is a bright red line in the sand for society and civilization versus barbarism. And we cannot tolerate it. And all who value a civil society and individual liberties must stand together in this moment against that.
Personally, I would say I am neither a conservative nor a Christian, as Charlie was, and I would have vehemently disagreed with him on many of his stated positions. But the whole point is that and I never had the pleasure to meet him in person, but if I had, we could have had vigorous debate. And that is the point. And Charlie was someone who respected debate, respected free speech, and now sadly has become a martyr for it. And I think all of us who do understand the value of free speech, who understand that it is an achievement and an accomplishment of civilization that we have made this distinction between words and violence. Yes, yes, words harm, but there is a very clear distinction between words and violence that so many want to blur or obscure, perhaps for their own nefarious ends or perhaps just for being useful pawns, as they sometimes say. But I think those of us who really do understand this issue, this is the moment when we have to make clear that there is that bright line distinction between words and violence. Words let you go home to your family.
Yeah,
Violence does not.
yeah, and that is a key point here because I one of the things that's been most troubling to me, beyond just the shock and horror of the event and the attack and the murder and the very public way that it was done, which again was clearly premeditated to evoke and send a message culture wide for us all to see, um, is has been the reaction since by a not insignificant number of people. People like to talk about the radical fringes, and there's no doubt that numerically they are still minority, but they are not insignificant minorities. And I have just personally been shocked within even my own personal social network and on social media channels to see so many people that I am associated with or connected to or even somewhat friendly with, who particularly, and I don't want to make this necessarily a partisan thing, but right now the correlation is definitely towards those who are ideological opponents of Charlie, primarily on the left, who are rationalizing, justifying, or outright celebrating his death. And the root of it, from what I can tell and or from what they themselves are saying, is this point that you noted, Joya, of equating words with violence. And I will make it, I guess, not partisan but ideological, because insofar as this idea has been growing in the culture, it definitely comes from the political left, particularly from thinkers in the university system who are overwhelmingly of a left-wing bent, which in my mind really means, kind of with aims towards greater statist government and social structures, outright socialist or communist, agendas and leanings, or what we now know as the critical race and critical kind of theory discourse. But point being, this idea that words are violence has come out of the ideology and discourse in that community. And that is, I think, a huge source of the problem, because once you blur the distinction between words and actions, then people start to think that words that offend or words that harm or words that they don't like are justify violence in response. And that is never the case. Even the most ardent communist, with whom I would agree with nothing about politically, not only would I defend their right to say it, but I would encourage their right to say it, because as the saying goes, iron sharpens iron. And I believe that it's only in exposing, letting the communists speak, that we can expose how bad their ideas are and let capitalism and freedom and reason prevail. And so I would never think to silence them, nor would I equate their words with violence. But this is a huge problem, and it's a rampant idea even really at the subconscious level now, I think, unfortunately, across the culture for many people, it's escaped the universities and the ivory tower, as we like to say, and trickled down to the average person. Um, and it is becoming a cover for basically really bad behavior and really emotional behavior to rationalize things that you don't like or things that offend you or just words that offend you. And I just want to stand again and say that offense is your problem, not someone else's problem, and it's definitely not any grounds to violate someone else's rights just to make your offense that you think that they're causing go away.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I think now this puts a very interesting onus of responsibility on people like you and me, those of us who are standing up for free speech, who want to make the case for free speech. What do we do about this now in this moment? There is a big open question you and I have talked about online, recognizing that so many people in our culture have been essentially radicalized by a certain ideology. What do we do about that? And what can we do as individuals who have this show? What can we do for the future?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's definitely one that I have been mulling a lot this week. Frankly, had been mulling for a long time, seeing a lot of these trends, as you can well recount, because we've been in the trenches together. We've been fighting the growing censorious trends since our college days. In many ways, it was a formative experience of how we came to be such fighters for freedom. But it definitely has taken on a much more urgent sense in recent years, and definitely in recent weeks, and this week in particular. So um, it's a tricky problem because we want to respect, as we just said, we want to respect and we must respect every individual's right to hold the views that they want and to express them, however abhorrent or vehement, however abhorrent we may find them or vehemently we may disagree with them. But, there's clearly, when you're dealing with people who don't respect the same in you, that's where the problem is here. And the words equals violence crowd and ideology, anybody who subscribes to that is already essentially abandoning reason on some level and giving themselves or others license to treat words in the same way as if they would treat actual physical violence. And that, I think, is one of the key problems that is raised and brought to the fore by Charlie's murder. And that we must, and that's what makes it so troubling. How do we deal with that? Because in some sense those people are beyond reason, or they're rejecting reason on some level, and yet debate, discourse, free speech is all about trying to debate ideas, put them under a microscope to see whose are better, whose make more sense under logical scrutiny, and kind of life-serving values. And when someone rejects that, what do you do in a way that still respects a free society? I don't have a good answer in this moment. I have emotional impulses, but I know those aren't sufficient for an answer. So, um, I would never lead with those. And I think it's precisely in emotionally charged, emotional times like this, in the aftermath of a very awful, horrific event, that we all don't shoot from the hip, so to speak, or lead with our hearts. But it's a challenge for sure, and one I guess I would throw out even to our audience to help us think through and ideas of how to deal with. I definitely think I want to believe, the optimist in me always wants to believe that nobody is ever totally beyond reason. But I do also, the realist in me also recognizes there are many people who choose to forsake it, and that those, you have to deal with them in a different way. Certainly anybody who's willing to take up force, physical violence, and initiate it against somebody can and should be dealt with in retaliatory or self-defensive force to prevent harm to innocents. So that's, I think, a key principle. And one way we have to deal with certainly people like this shooter and others who would take up arms or force like him. Um, but beyond that, there's obviously a whole institution and system of institutions that uphold this ideology, that promote this view of words or violence for many reasons, like you noted. We could get into those in a different discussion of why, but the point is they hold them and they're propagating them. So what do we do about them? I don't have a good answer immediately.
And I do think that is the question that is on you and me now as creators, as builders, to start to think through in this new moment. What does it mean? This moment, I think, has revealed something about where we're at as a culture, which makes our project all the more necessary, but the direction we need to take less clear, at least in the moment. So
Yeah.
hopefully this is even a call to action for anyone and everyone listening to help us think through what could be some of the most effective ways to advocate for free speech where we are now. But I think we can go back to, and you pointed out that in our original statement way back 5 years ago when we were first founding our organization, 1776 forward, we outlined three key areas. And I think these are still valid, although the big question is what exactly ought we be doing under each. But maybe you want to outline that for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, to give more practice, as I start thinking through that question, and just the more broader question of how do we go forward and not just maintain, but clearly strengthen, rebuild a more philosophically liberal society, one that values life first and foremost, the life of each individual, regardless of whether you agree with them on politics or not, and then one that respects all of our other freedoms. Um, when we founded 1776 Forward, our original manifesto, our founding manifesto, it was in the year of 2020, which was also a very chaotic, violent, illiberal year, in many ways a high watermark year to some extent for illiberalism in American culture. Um, and we were wrestling with a similar variation of this question: what to do in the face of all of that tyranny and illiberalism that we lived through. And we ultimately came upon three calls to action: stand up for the good, say no to the bad, and do what we as Americans do best: build and make something new, new institutions, organizations, businesses, ideas, products, services that reflect philosophically liberal values. So, I return to those as a touchstone. I think we always will. That's why they're in our manifesto. And I think they're the three best advice, in thinking about how to apply that to a situation like this. And, the problem that it reflects of growing polarization, tribalization, division between different groups within our politics, and inability to converse civilly with them. Um, I would say first and foremost, doing things like we're doing. We have this platform, we created it on our own. It's still nascent. We're still trying to grow it. It's not very big in the scheme of the culture, but it's our effort to have a say in the culture. You don't even have to have that. If you just want to share your views, stand up, speak out for your values and what you think is right or what you think is wrong, um, do it on social media, in your own friends and family community. Find a forum to do that. That's one way you can do that, to say that you stand with Charlie, and against the kind of violence that took his life. That's one thing. I think saying no to the bad is particularly important in a time like this. It's something I've been availing myself, even in just recent days. Definitely when I see people celebrating or trying to rationalize the murder of someone whose ideas or words they disagreed with, I am starting to call that out. And I think we need more of that. There's something to, I am by no means a thought police, quite the opposite, but there is something to upholding certain minimum civilizational values, mores, and norms, what we used to call kind of social shaming. And I think um, that we need to make it socially unacceptable for people to be running around celebrating the murder of their fellow citizens because they hold political ideas they disagree with, however vehement they think they are. And and then lastly, building more liberal institutions, get involved one way or another in some form of organization, business, community group, just a group of your friends, and find ways to promote positive, philosophically liberal values for freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, um, the American Constitution, and the free society, and the government of limited separated powers that it reflects, um, and other values that are important to you, tolerance and acceptance, and actually practicing it, not just paying lip service to it, really tolerating, and then engage with other people who you disagree, but disagree civilly. Have civil disagreements civilly is a phrase that I came across in speaking with some very wise friends in some organizations we've interviewed on this podcast. And so that too, do what Charlie was doing, engage people respectfully but civilly for their own views. Get curious, be humble about your own, be willing to learn, open minded, and get curious. But also don't yield if you have your values and convictions. People want to, I've seen very sad rationalizations about Charlie's murder because he was provocative in some of the things he said. But so what? Guess what? That's politics. That's ideas that really matter to people. And yes, sometimes they even offend, as we've talked about. But um, we can't give up on standing up for our values, and we certainly can't be cowed into fear or intimidated for defending them. And there's nothing wrong with holding your views strongly and advocating for them passionately, and even sometimes being polemical about that. That is the nature of rhetoric and discourse, and there's certainly nothing morally wrong with it. If someone's inciting imminent threats or harms to people, that's a different, very narrow case, but that's not really what we're talking about. And it's one of those usually very clear examples that most people know when it's happening and that it's clear wrong. But simply holding strong views on politics or culture, philosophy, religion, I mean, it goes with the territory. So I would also say to people, if that troubles you, buck up a little bit, because that's part of being human. So don't shy away from that, even as you seek to engage with other people. That would be what I would advise. So, I just encourage everybody, again, stand up for the good, say no to the bad, and start building new, better, philosophically liberal organizations that promote freedom of speech, the value of each individual life, and let's uphold the culture that certainly Charlie Kirk, in the ways that he knew how to, was trying to build, that I believe even many of the people who don't agree with him on the political left side of the equation, or the political right or the center, also still believe in and are working towards. Um, you know, that's the least we can do to make sure that the ominous portent of his death does not become our ominous future.